Over 2 years ago, when I first moved back to Indiana, one of the first things that I did was try to join various social media groups so that I could begin to learn about and connect with the local community. And so I'm on Madison County To Go and Pendleton Chatter and Anderson, Indiana Current Events, and I'm on my local neighborhood Springbrooks social media page. I'm also on the Nextdoor app, and these apps help me learn about the good, also help me learn about the bad and the ugly. They help me reach out and help people from time to time. Quite often, people are looking for a church recommendation, so these pages are easy ways to keep our eyes open for evangelism opportunities. But most anybody that knows that these pages and has been on these pages knows that they can also be forums for the squeaky wheels of the world and hotbeds of criticism. People are very quick to report bad food service, reckless driving, local crimes, recent police calls. In my neighborhood, there are watchdogs who seem to follow around the dogs of the neighborhood and where they are using the restroom or not using the restroom as they should be. And I probably see posts about that nearly monthly. And I think one of the things that we notice when we see these complaints and these criticisms is people want their neighbors to do better. I'm not sure venting about it on social media is the key or the best way to always handle that. Instead, I think being the change that you want to see is the key. And so where does that start? Well, for us as Christians, it starts, if we want to be better neighbors, by looking to Jesus for the answers. It starts by looking to his word for the wisdom that we need to be better neighbors. And so today we want to do just that. We want to look at Luke 10, and we want to consider what Jesus says, it's recorded in his word, about being a good neighbor. This is really part 2 of the lesson that we started last week. And so we want to read a little bit of the text that we read last week, and then we'll reread what we just heard so that it's fresh in our minds. But verse 25 says this, "Behold, a lawyer stood up to put Jesus to the test, saying, 'Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?' And Jesus said to him, 'Well, what is written in the law? How do you read it?' He answered, 'You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself.'" 2 rules. We talked about it last week. Just love God, love people. And he said to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live." But he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him. He bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. And then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, 'Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back.' Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers?" And he said, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus said to him, "You go and do likewise." Now this story may be familiar to you, it may not, but it's the perfect Bible text to show us what it means to be a good neighbor. And so I want to dig a little deeper into this passage by looking first of all at some of the characters. Let's notice there are basically about 5 groups of characters here as we think about the Good Samaritan. And if you'll consider with me, 4 out of those 5 groups are really not good examples of neighbors. For example, we have the thieves and the robbers. What do the thieves and the robbers do? Well, the thieves and the robbers, they take the man's money. They take the man's clothes. They take the man's goods. They beat him down, and they leave him half dead. There is no neighbor love in that. And yet, sadly, there are neighbors like that. That's why a lot of people today are putting video cameras up all over their houses, because we're trying to limit people from stealing packages and stealing items from around our houses. When we lived in Ohio, Hattie left her scooter out one time and on a warm day, and the scooter disappeared. When I lived in Kokomo, my car stereo was taken. My truck was regularly rummaged out in front of our house at our original first living place. My bike was stolen. I rode my bike to church one day. It's right under my office window. My bike was stolen right from underneath the church office window. My church office was robbed. It was ransacked when I lived there. It's a shady character who doesn't respect the property rights of his fellow man. But that's what the thieves and the robbers do. And many of you could tell your stories of being robbed or having something stolen from you. We also have the priest, though. The priest may have been on his way from Jerusalem to his country home. He saw this injured person on the side of the road, and he passes by on the other side. Now think about that for a moment. A man who would have taught others what the law says about loving your neighbor as yourself, but he's not living out those principles when he's given the opportunity. There is no neighbor love in that. I am shocked by the way some people behave when it comes to helping those in need. Today, have you ever seen those videos where somebody's getting beat up or somebody's getting injured and somebody's getting hurt? And do you ever think to yourself, why are you taking a video? Why aren't you helping the person who is in need? Why are you just watching this happen? Somebody needs to step in here and break up the fight. Somebody needs to go help the injured person. And you're just watching and recording. This kind of sensationalization of tragedy, it's desensitized us to the real needs of our fellow man. But then we have a third character. It's the Levite. Here's a religious man. He may have been on his way to serve in the temple at Jerusalem. He comes, takes a look at the problem, but he keeps on walking. There is no neighbor love in that. How heartless do you have to be to see a problem and to just walk away from it? Religious people ought to know better. But how often do we hear of our own brethren who are sick, brethren who are facing surgeries, people who are suffering, and we just listen and we do nothing to help? We ought to be, when the announcements are going on right before 10:20, pulling out our notepad or our notes on our phone, and we ought to be taking notes. Who is it that's going into surgery this week that I could help or that I could attend to? Who is it who's just gone through surgeries, who maybe is going to need a little extra help? And what can I do to help and to attend to this need? If you just hear the announcements with no intent to do anything about it, when you can do something about certain situations and be a helper, then you're really no different than the Levite, who hears about the problem, sees the problem, but does nothing to volunteer to make a difference in the problem. The world will be a better place when we have more people who are willing to help. But then you have the innkeeper, and you might think, well, the innkeeper seems like a decent person, but I want you to think about this. If you're only helping because there's an advantage to helping, like money, something in it for you, then that's really not neighbor love either. That's doing something because you're getting a return. Jesus once said, do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. And sadly, there are some people who will only help if there is something in it for them. That is exploitation, not compassion. Then we have the Samaritan. The Samaritan is full of compassion. The Samaritan goes to the wounded man, bandages him up, uses his own oil and wine as medicine, lifts the man onto his animal, rides him to town to stay with the innkeeper until he heals up, gives him money. This is true neighbor love. This is what Jesus says about that Samaritan. Jesus says, which of these three, He asked the question to the one who wanted to know, who is my neighbor? Which of these three, the priest, the Levite, or the Samaritan, was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? And the expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus told him, well, go and do likewise. That's what it means to be a good neighbor. You want to know what a neighbor is? You want to know what a good neighbor is? A good neighbor is the one who sees a need and acts on it. This entire story is really an illustration of what benevolent, sacrificial love for our neighbors really looks like. It's a contrast of true love for neighbor with utter selfishness when it comes to others. And so I want to look into that a little bit deeper. And I want to pull out some inspired thoughts from the text that can motivate us in our own lives. The first thing that I want you to consider is that as you think about the Good Samaritan, there are a number of excuses that he could have used. And sometimes the reasons why we don't help is because we think that we have a good excuse. I want you to think about some of the excuses that could have been running through his mind as he thought about helping. Well, he could have said this, well, I want to help, but it's too dangerous because if they robbed him, they might rob me. And that could be right. If there were people lurking behind the rocks and the trees that were on that path from Jerusalem to Jericho who robbed the person who was in need, well, they could have robbed him too. But he doesn't let that stop him. He could have said, perhaps this is what the priests and the Levites said, I'm too busy. I've got important matters to attend to. I've got, an appointment at 11:30, and I can't make time to stop. If I stop, it's just going to throw off my entire schedule and my entire day. But he doesn't let that stop him. He helps, takes as long as he needs, takes care of the person. He could have said to himself, this might look bad. I mean, if they see me on the side of the road with this guy who's like half naked, half dead, beat up, bruised, people are going to think, I'm like his compadre, and I don't want people to think that about me. I don't want people to think that I'm connected to this person, and so I'm going to stay out of this. But he doesn't let that stop him either. He could have said, this is too expensive. I'm on a really strict budget. And I don't really want to spend extra money on this right now because I'm saving for a really nice vacation. We're wanting to go over to the Mediterranean Sea and hang out on the port. And so I don't want to dip into that fund any. And so this is going to cost too much. I've got other places that I've committed to spend my money. And so because I don't want to, break the bank doing this, I'm just going to keep walking. Or he could have said this, and sometimes we say this. What kind of idiot was traveling along this dangerous road anyway? He had it coming. What were you doing there? Why were you traveling by yourself? And that is what some people would probably say about this guy. This was a dangerous road. There were robbers and thieves all the time. You don't just walk through 8 Mile up in Detroit. You don't do that. That's a dangerous area. But guess what? Sometimes people do dangerous things. They do foolish things. And they still need help. And the Samaritan helps. There was a story that was told of 2 liberal sociologists, and they were walking down the street. And they saw a man that was lying unconscious, and he was covered with cuts and bruises from a terrible mugging. And one of the sociologists turned over to his colleague and said, whoever did this terrible deed really needs our help. Do you get that? What about the guy who got mugged? Let's help him. The Samaritan could have used these excuses, but he didn't. And we need to be careful that we're not making excuses for why we don't help. Instead, what we find here are the simple gifts of the Samaritan. And these simple gifts, I believe, are simple things that we can share when we have the ability to do so ourselves. Instead of making excuses, he gave. Well, what did he give? Well, the first thing that he gave was he gave his compassion. He felt the tugging of his heart and his heartstrings towards a man who was in need, despite the fact that there was a war between Jews and Samaritans. John chapter 4 and verse 9 says that, Jews and Samaritans didn't get along very well. Sometimes they didn't help one another, but he didn't care about that. He just had compassion towards someone who is in need, who happened to be his fellow man. And he didn't consider any of those other factors before helping him. So he gave his compassion, and that's the first key. If it doesn't start with having compassion for another human being, then any of these other gifts, you won't give any of them. So first of all, in your heart, you have to have some compassion for someone who is in a desperate, difficult situation. What does he do once he has compassion? Well, the second thing he does is he's willing to use his own strength to lift him. His own strength to lift him. He puts him on his own animal. He walks alongside. Sometimes those who are in need just need our strength. They need some manpower. Multiple times I've seen us when someone's moving. I've seen us band together and go help someone who's moving. Why? They just need some strength. They need somebody to pick up some dressers and some furniture and to carry it to a truck and then carry it into the new place that they're living. They just need a little bit of strength, a little bit of manpower. You wouldn't want to move your entire house by yourself, and they don't either. And so what do? You pitch in to help. Sometimes it's pushing a car out of a ditch. Sometimes it's carrying a load. I see people on a regular basis, before services, after services. There are people who are helping others get to their car. They're picking up their walkers and they're putting them into the back of the car. They're putting their wheelchairs into the back of the car. Why? Because sometimes people just need a little bit of strength. They need a steady arm to lean on for the elderly. One of the most beautiful things that happened here in the first few months I was here was on a really rainy Sunday. It was pouring down rain, and I saw our teenage men grabbing umbrellas and just walking every single person out to the car, getting drenched themselves. They just needed a little strength, a little umbrella. And you pitched in to do that. It means something to people when you take the time to see that they need a little bit of help, and you help. He's not only willing to do that, he's willing to give his food. This person needs hydrated, perhaps. This person needs medicated. And one of the simple standards of judgment for us is going to be whether or not we helped others with little things like food when we had the opportunity. In Matthew 25, Jesus talks about those who are on his right hand and those who are on his left hand. And he says, the people who are going to be on my right hand, the people who are saved, are people who saw that, you needed something to drink and I gave you some water. You needed some food and I gave you some food. And so that's something simple we can do. Someone just needs a meal. Many times I've seen us do this at the congregation as well. We put up a meal list. Somebody's having surgery or having a baby or going through something difficult. We put up a meal list and you offer to bring food. It's just a simple act of compassion to help people. He also offers up his animal to the man who was too weak to walk. Now, you may not have ridden your horse or donkey to this church today, but many of you do have horsepower, right? You've got 180 horsepower or 240 horsepower. Sometimes all somebody needs is a ride to get somewhere. And I see many people here doing that too. John, I've been incredibly impressed with John here recently because he's got two people in wheelchairs. He's driving all the way to Greenfield, Indiana to pick them up and to bring them here. That says a lot about what John's doing. He cares enough to offer a ride and to go pick people up and to take them to services. And I see people doing that for others who are here as well. But it's one of the simple ways we help when people are in need. He also gave of his money. Some people will give of their money because they have a lot of it, but they won't give you any time because their time is too precious. Some people will give you their time because they have a lot of it. When you mention giving money, they get tight-fisted. The Good Samaritan was willing to give in all of these areas. He gives the innkeeper 2 days' wages to take care of the man and offers even more if the need is greater. True love spends. But he also gives his time. He's on a journey somewhere. We don't know where he's headed, but he alters his course. He delays his plans to see to this need. Some people don't really need your strength. They don't really need your food. They don't even need your ride. They don't even need your money. But it sure can mean a lot to them if you just give them a little bit of your time. Some people could really use your time and your ear. I'd also suggest, though, the Good Samaritan gave up his own clothes. After all, where did the victim's bandages come from? Was he carrying around a first aid kit? Probably not. He didn't use the victim's clothes. Victim's clothes were stolen from. So I'd suggest to you that the Good Samaritan literally ripped the shirt off of his own back, tore his clothes to turn them into bandages, and that is what sacrificial love is. And it's what Jesus did when he left heaven. He stripped himself of the privileges and the prerogatives of living in heaven as deity to come to earth and to live as a man for us. He humbled himself, made himself of no reputation, Philippians 2 says, so that he could come here and so he could be of help and service to us as mankind. Well, what are the lessons that we can learn from the Samaritan? Well, one of the first lessons is this. Sometimes people are hurting because they are foolish. Help them anyway. For 15 years, when I was in Kokomo, we had business meetings. We didn't have elders for 15 years, and so I was in those business meetings for 15 years. And sometimes you hear this when somebody is in need. Well, they were kind of dumb with their money. I don't really think we need to help with that. They've really made some foolish decisions, some stupid decisions. Yeah, sometimes people do make stupid decisions. Sometimes people do make foolish decisions. That does not relieve us of helping when there is a need to help. You help anyway. Think about this man. It was on the side of the road. The road from Jerusalem to Jericho was a notoriously dangerous road. Jerusalem is 2,300 feet above sea level. The Dead Sea, which is where Jericho, near where Jericho stood, it's 1,300 feet below sea level. So in somewhat less than 20 miles, the road drops 3,600 feet. That's a really big drop in elevation. And so the road was a road of narrow and rocky turnings. And because of the way the road was situated, it was a happy hunting ground for robbers. People knew that if you were on this road, that you were probably carrying money from one city to another, and you're probably carrying goods, and so it was a great place to rob people. That said, the traveler must have been somewhat foolhardy and somewhat reckless, because people didn't travel this road alone if they were carrying valuables and goods. They traveled in numbers for safety's sake. But despite the fact the man was hurting, largely due to his own foolishness, the Good Samaritan helps anyway. Second lesson that we learn, the Samaritan's love was without prejudice towards his nationality or towards this person's religion. The injured man must have been a fellow Jew. The helper seems to have been a Samaritan. There was a very big religious rift between these two groups, but the Samaritan still helps when he sees the hurting man. William Taylor writes in his Parables of the Savior, he says, nationality is swallowed up by humanity. Sectarianism is put to flight by religion as he dismounts to minister to a suffering fellow man. Too often we refuse to help people because they're not of our same social class, they are not of our same color, they are not of our same religious affiliation, they're not of our same party, they're not of our same family, but at the core we are all God's creation, and when God's creatures are in need and we have the opportunity to fill it, true love acts without prejudice. And that's one of the lessons I think Jesus is trying to teach by making the point. This was a Samaritan that did this. Third lesson, is the best kind of help is sensitive to the type of help which is needed. I want you to think about that. Some people's benevolence is well meant, but sometimes it can be a total failure. And let me give you an example. In the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey, there were people that were loading up trucks to send teddy bears and toys to the little kids who had lost everything. I think people are well-meaning when they do that. If you loaded up a teddy bear or a toy, I'm not trying to hurt your feelings here today. But many of these people had no clean drinking water. They needed water. They needed generators to run their power so they could get to work. They needed fans to dry out the wet houses before serious mold problems began to destroy everything. So the first trucks that came in there, they didn't need to be filled with teddy bears and toys. They need to be filled with necessities to meet needs. The right type of help meets the actual need. If we throw money, for example, at people who need instruction on how to budget their money, who will wastefully spend that money on their addictions, that can be a total waste. What they need is instruction on how to better budget their money and quit wasting. You give furniture to someone who has furniture, but they can't pay their bills. Well, that's not really what they needed to meet the need. The need has to be assessed. The right type of help has to be offered. There is nothing in what the Samaritan offered to help that was unnecessary or that was excessive. It's a beautiful story because it perfectly finds the need and it fills the need in every way possible. Well, the final lesson that we might learn is this: true love doesn't just feel, but it acts. The Hollywood version of love today is very touchy. It's very emotionally based love. People say, oh, I fell in love, and so I had a feeling. And then they get divorced because, well, I fell out of love. And it's based on feelings. Love goes far beyond feelings. Your feelings, your good intentions, your emotions, they are useless if you do not put them into action. Jesus doesn't say, well, just have compassion like the Good Samaritan. No, Jesus says, go and do. Do what he did. Put your compassion to action. It's not just enough to talk about our neighbor's problems or to have discussions or conferences or political forums about what the need is. You see the problems. Jesus wants you to translate your feelings into responsible action and to do what you can to meet the need. And we see that with the Samaritan. I want to finish with a bigger picture of what this text might be teaching us. And some people, they don't like to put a spiritual spin on this text, and they may be right. Perhaps this is just literally a lesson about being a good helper to our neighbors who have physical needs. No more, no less. But I can't help but think of how this applies to the deeper spiritual needs of all mankind. So I want you to consider the symbolic, the spiritual picture that Jesus may have been painting with the man who needed help. I want you to think about this picture for a minute. Jerusalem was the holy city. Jerusalem was the place of the temple. It was the place of God's presence within the temple. Where was this certain man headed? He was headed away from Jerusalem. He was headed away from the holy city. He was headed away from God's presence. He was on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. In other words, he had turned his back on God's holy city. He was headed somewhere else. When we turn our backs on God, we are being foolish and we are being sinful. And we need the help of God. But how many times do we see people who have turned their backs on God, who are being foolish, who are being sinful, and sometimes we just pass by on the other side? So whether it be the physical needs of your fellow man or the spiritual needs, we need to be more inclined to help. Not just when they're in the holy city. We're on duty at all times, and that's being a true neighbor. Many times it seems like churches, they're surrounded by people that desperately need to hear the gospel, but Christians are content to share it only with those that manage to come inside their church. Things that we might consider about this Samaritan story. He left Jerusalem and people were going. The Good Samaritan was going to him to help him outside of the holy city. All right. That's the lesson for you here today. And so if you're ready to get started to go and to do, then this journey begins with the confession of your faith in Jesus as the Son of God, your Lord and Savior. You need to start living life his way, not your own. What that means is you need to repent. You could be washed of all your past sins, if you'll be baptized into him, if you'll be raised with him from the waters to walk in a new life, not living for yourself, but living for the God who loves us all. But if you're already a Christian, I think this lesson most certainly is for you too. And I want you to think about this lesson, not just here today. I don't want this lesson to just enter our ears today and then it kind of leaves our minds for the rest of the week. I want you to think about this lesson all week long as you think about who is it that you cross paths with who could really use your help and your encouragement and your compassion. I think it's very good timing that we're studying this lesson this week because right now at the church in Anderson, we have some people who are not here because they're recovering from hospital stays. We have several others. They are scheduled for surgeries, and I'm sure that you heard the list before services started. There's a pretty long list of people who are scheduled for surgeries in the next couple of weeks. Some of these people are going to need extra help in the days to come. Some of these needs have been announced. Ask yourself this blunt question. When you hear it announced that someone among us needs help, are you like the priest and the Levite, just hearing it and then going about your business like you always have been throughout the week? Or are you seeing what you can do to help fill the need? So this is a lesson for us. It's a lesson for me that a Christian needs to know better than the Samaritan, don't we? Christ once said, the children of this world, they're in their generation wiser than the children of light. Let's not allow the children of this world to outshine the children of light. God's people, we should know what it is we're supposed to be doing, and we should be doing it. Light is meant to shine in dark places. So let's not be afraid to shine our lights in the coming days, in the coming weeks, and go and do likewise.